I'm Uncle Bob, and this is Clean Code.
Hi, I am Amanda. Hi, I'm Samantha. Hi, I'm Alexis. Hi, I'm Mama. Welcome to another episode of
Clean Code.
Clean Code. Your best episode of your to begin again in this episode by Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob. Enjoy. Uncle Bob.
Welcome to Clean Code, episode 11, the Liskov Substitution Principle. Come on in. This is our fourth episode in the series of the solid principles. And take your hat. Remember last time we talked about Bertrand Meyer's open-close principle? That was Bertrand Meyer's remarkable insight that a module could be both open for extension and closed for modification. We figured out that it would be possible to add new features to a system by adding new code and not changing any old code. Come on up. I told you that the open-close principle was the moral center of system architecture, that good architects and designers will strive to make their systems open for extension but closed for modification. And then we looked at a system that just broke all the rules, and it exhibited all those horrible design smells of rigidity, fragility, and immobility. And then we looked at a system that was perfectly conformant, or so we thought. It was simple, it was beautiful, it was elegant, and it was a lie. Then we found that in order to perfectly conform to the open-close principle, you have to have perfect foresight. If you're going to make a system that is infinitely extensible, you've got to be able to perfectly predict the future. But we didn't give up hope. In the end, we realized that if we used a process that was iterative, if we relied on lots of feedback, if we delivered often, and if we used lots and lots of refactoring, then we could well enough conform to the open-close principle. Now, in this episode, after we talk a little bit about wave-particle duality, we're going to discuss the principle that governs inheritance, polymorphism, and subtyping, the Liskov substitution principle. So first, we're going to take a stroll through the history and theory of types, from their mathematical underpinnings to their application in computers. Now, I see all you Ruby, Groovy, Python, and Clojure programmers thinking that, no, this doesn't apply to me. But it does. It applies to you. Because the rules of types apply, whether the compiler checks those types or not. Next, we'll talk about subtypes. We'll discuss Barbara Liskov's critical insight into the definition of subtypes. We'll talk about why that definition is important and the implications of that definition for static and dynamic languages. Next, we'll dive into the wonderful old square rectangle paradox, the definitive case for the Liskov substitution principle, and we'll see what can go wrong when you use inheritance and subtyping intuitively instead of according to Liskov's definition. This will lead us to some heuristics, examples, and rules that will help us detect and solve violations of the Liskov substitution principle. Finally, we'll look at a larger case study that shows how easy it is to create substitution violations that you don't recognize right away. And then we'll see the terrible damage that's done by such violations. And in the end, we'll look at some simple ways to either avoid or repair that damage. So you put your thinking caps on and sharpen your pencils, because we're about to submerge ourselves in the fascinating world of the Liskov substitution principle. As we learned last time, in 1900, Max Planck discovered that although light moves in Maxwell's waves, it's also absorbed and emitted in discrete amounts of energy. Einstein went on to show that this discreteness in the light waves was an attribute of the light waves themselves, and not of the atoms that were emitting and absorbing them. That is, the light waves were organized into discrete quantities of energy, which Einstein called light quanta, and we now call photons. So somehow light is both a wave and a particle. But we should be clear about what the word particle means. In this case, it does not mean hard little nugget. Instead, it means discrete and indivisible. A photon of light is a bundle of energy that cannot be split apart. It always equals Planck's constant times its frequency. What does it mean for a particle to have a frequency? Therein lies the fascinating tale of wave-particle duality. Light travels in waves. It carries its energy in waves. But when it's forced to deposit that energy on some surface or some entity, it always does so in discrete amounts at discrete point-like locations. And that discrete amount and that discrete location is the photon. That's clear, isn't it? So, maybe an example would help. This is my green laser pen. I use it when I'm giving talks. It's very bright. This laser pen is a photon gun. It fires a stream of photons in a very narrow beam. The number of photons it fires is huge, but discrete. Those photons leave this gun, and they travel in a wave towards the wall. When that wave strikes the wall, the wave deposits its energies upon the atoms of the wall in discrete amounts upon discrete atoms. Those atoms then reflect those photons back outwards towards our eyes, and we see the green spot on the wall. Now, let's just say that I had a knob on this laser pen that would adjust the rate at which the photons were fired. Maybe I could turn that knob all the way down so that it fired 1 photon a second. Kind of like that. And then the blinks you would see on the wall would be 1 photon each, depositing its energy at a particular discrete location with a very particular discrete energy. So, now let's crank the firing rate of this laser back up to trillions of photons per second, and we'll shine it through something that's got a bunch of tiny little slits in it, like my comb. What should we see on the wall? Presumably the beam will pass through the slits and strike the wall, and so we should see 1 green spot on the wall. But if you looked closely inside that spot, you would see the shadow of the slits. We can illustrate this by using this flashlight and a paper plate with 2 big holes in it. We can still see the flashlight beam, but only the part that's getting through the 2 holes. But now let's go back to my laser, and instead of a comb, we'll use this diffraction grating, which has got a whole bunch of little slits in it, 13,500 per inch. We'll shine that laser through this again, and we get stripes, spots. Look at that. And of course, that's exactly what you'd expect if the light were traveling in waves. You see, the waves pass through the slits in the diffraction grating. They break up into a bunch of little tiny independent waves, 1 for each slit. Those little waves move towards the wall, But as they do so, they interfere with each other, resulting in this characteristic pattern of wave interference. That, my friends, is an interference pattern. And if I take the slits away, I get one nice little spot on the screen. I put the slits back in, I get the interference pattern again. How cool is this? So now let's crank our laser pen down so that it's only firing 1 photon per second. What do we see? Well, we see 1 flash per second, all right. But the location of those flashes is strange. They seem to be all over the screen. It's as though the photons have no idea which direction to go. But if we accumulate all those little flashes over an hour or so, we find something really startling. We see the interference pattern. Each photon travels as a wave. That wave passes through the slits and breaks into many waves, which then interfere with themselves. And yet the photon still lands at a discrete location with a discrete energy. Where will the photon land? There's no way to know. It's completely random. But the odds are that the photon's going to land where the interference pattern is bright. The odds are very low that the photon will land where the interference pattern is dim. Did you hear what I just said? I said odds. Odds. What is it that determines where a photon will land? Odds. Odds in the shape of an interference pattern. Apparently, the wave of a photon is a wave of odds, a wave of chance. A light wave is not a wave through the ether. It's a wave of probabilities. And that just makes my head hurt. And so these waves of probability propagate through space and interfere with each other, leaving an interference pattern of probability on the screen. The position of the photon is undetermined until that photon strikes the wall and deposits its energy. Up to that time, the position of the photon is uncertain. And the principle behind that uncertainty will be our topic for next time. All right, now I want you to be a little bit patient, because what you're about to hear is going to sound like another science lecture, but it's not. It's actually quite relevant to the Liskov substitution principle. In the second half of the 19th century,